Well, hello everyone. Welcome to my first post since Invest for the Future has gone into hibernation. What better topic to investigate than the choice that we have before us on May 21st? For many of us, while our vote will be a contributor to the outcome in our own electorate, it is unlikely to make a real difference in the sense that we live in seats where a large enough majority of the voters are either rusted onto the Labor Party or rusted onto the coalition. That change is most unlikely. But our decision for who we want to represent us in the Senate will be important, as the makeup of the upper house will determine the extent to which the legislative agenda of the elected government can be implemented. So to help you make your decision, I thought it might be helpful to look at the track record of our governments over the last 15 years. Of course, there is no guarantee that a future Labor government would deliver the same sorts of outcomes as previous Labor governments, and the same applies to any future coalition government if it is returned. But one thing is absolutely true in my humble opinion, and that is if it turns out that we end up with a minority government, it will not be the problem that Scomo is trying to convince us of. In fact, the minority Labor government was able to deliver some significant positive reforms and the world did not implode. And it certainly hasn't imploded under the minority Liberal government of the last 9 years. And yes, it is a minority government in which the policies and the agenda of the Liberal Party are massaged and adjusted to accommodate the demands of the Nationals. So after 12 years of minority government, 3 more, starting now with either Labor or Liberal having to negotiate with other parties, such as the Nationals or the Greens, or maybe a group of independents, will not be the end of civilisation as we know it. Now, I'm not going to bore you with some in-depth commentary on and opinion of the policies of any of the political parties seeking your vote, but rather I want to discuss with you the historical impacts on families of the policies of our government since 2007. And I'll do that through the lens of the economic circumstances of families, ranging from those in the direst of circumstances through to those who have more money than they know what to do with. The data that I'll refer to comes from the Australian Bureau of Statistics and covers the years 2007-8 through to 2020-21. So both the impacts of the GFC and of COVID are included in the numbers. So starting with the period from 2007-8 through to 2013-14, we can get a picture of the impact of Labor's economic management. Now the numbers on screen relate to gross household income and gross household net wealth, so it's not individuals. And we're looking at the roughly 6 years or so under the Labor government and finishing up at the end with the minority government. Interesting numbers here really. Across that 6 years, the average CPI was 2.7%, and across those 6 years, none of the quintiles, in other words, the bottom 20%, the next 20% and so on up to the highest 20% of households, managed to achieve growth in income anywhere near the inflation rate over that time. Something I wasn't really expecting to see. I was sort of expecting that under Labor that the lowest quintile would do better than the others, but the average growth in the highest quintile household income grew more than the second, third and fourth quintiles. So sort of interesting numbers there, but the key takeaway is that no group was able to match the CPI as far as their income growth was concerned. As far as their net wealth was concerned, the best performing groups were the 2 highest quintiles, but not surprised to see those numbers there either. Interesting to note that across that 6-year period, the second and third quintiles, their net wealth actually fell over that period. So not a good story there for the growth in people's net wealth. But we'll talk a little bit about that in relationship to the way the ASX performed in a moment or two. And comparing that to the economic circumstances of households during the period 2013-14 through to 2019-20, there are some notable differences in the changes across each of the 5 quintiles. And those differences can clearly be seen here in terms of household income, where previously, if we look at the Labor, we had the lowest and the highest quintile achieving the highest growth in household income. Under the coalition government from 2013-14 up to 2019-20, they performed poorest in terms of household income growth, and it was actually the second and third quintiles that did grow their income by the most, but again nowhere near the average CPI across that 6-year period, which was 1.7% growth in the cost of living on an annual basis. If we see how that then translates through into the growth in the net wealth of households, unfortunately, if you happen to be in the lowest quintile and you remained there, your net wealth actually fell by an average of 1.8% per year, dropping from 39,000 down to 35,000. So not a very good result, and not evidence that the coalition's policies have helped those who are the most vulnerable to improve their overall net wealth. But in the other quintiles, 1.8% ranging up to the best performing quintile, the top quintile, growing their net wealth at an annual rate of 2.8%, going from $2.77 million up to $3.267 million of net wealth across that 6-year period. Overlaying the performance of the ASX over those periods also makes for an interesting comparison. Now, it is true that the performance of the Australian stock market is very much related to what's happening in the global economy and does not move up and down in a totally uncorrelated way. But comparing the growth in households' net wealth with changes in the stock market is worthwhile, I think. I say this because for many households, some of their wealth is contained within their superannuation accounts, and much of that would be exposed to the stock market. And the stock market, as measured by the ASX 200 Index Fund, STW, across that 6 years of Labor fell by 3.3% per annum, courtesy of the GFC and then sort of the start of the recovery. If you add on the 4% possible dividends perhaps that would have been received each year, that's sort of delivering reasonably anemic growth from investments in the broad market index across that particular time frame. If we compare that with the performance of the quintiles with their net wealth, we can see that's pretty much mirrored here under the Labor government, where there's been limited improvement in the net wealth regardless of which quintile you're in, and in fact if you're in the second or the third quintile you actually went backwards, as I've mentioned, and there has been some muted growth if you happen to be in the lowest quintile or the second highest or highest quintile. But if we move forward to the 6 years of the coalition government, across that time frame the index fund increased by 3.7% per annum, and yes, we had COVID in here, and then by the time we got to the end of the next year it finished up about here, so perhaps the 3.7% might be a little bit lower if we added another year into the analysis, perhaps down at about 3.2%, but you add in 4% in dividends, and so investments in the broad index there would have delivered about a 7% or so return on investments. And if we look at the performance of the net wealth for the period under the coalition, we see that the second, third, fourth and the highest quintiles did grow their net wealth over that period, and that would be because in part quite a number of their investments would have been exposed to the Australian Stock Exchange, and because the market had a positive period over there, then that's reflected in the growth in the net wealth. The disappointing feature, and probably because many of the people in the lowest quintile will have limited funds within superannuation, their net wealth has managed to fall over that time. So they're the numbers there for the Labor and the coalition as far as income and net wealth is concerned on a household basis. I suspect that when the data for 2020-2021 becomes available, those wealth figures will change noticeably for families who own outright or have a mortgage over the house that they are buying. For those who own multiple houses, and of course they would be households in the two upper quintiles, the extraordinary increase in house prices over the last couple of years will ensure that their net wealth has risen noticeably since 2019-20. Now, it appears that all political parties agree that we need to see strong wages growth, but there is no agreement on how to achieve that. As I script this, the Fair Work Commission is considering what the appropriate increase in the minimum wage should be. Albo has announced that he thinks a 5.1% rise would be appropriate, given that is the current inflation rate, which is predicted to go even higher in the near term. Scomo, on the other hand, has described that as economic vandalism. I doubt that Scomo is right, and I suspect that the Fair Work Commission will likely deliver an increase which is actually less than 5.1%. But looking at those historical numbers under both Labor and Coalition stewardship, the most vulnerable in our society have not been treated well by the decisions that successive governments have made. And that is no more clearly shown than in the 2020 report on poverty, which found that 3.2 million people in Australia are living below the poverty line, including 774,000 children and 424,800 young people. And that's sort of remembering Bob Hawke saying way back in the 80s that by the time 1990 comes, then no child in Australia need be living in poverty. So therefore, in the next 30 years, we really have made no dent on that. And I do think that is really not good enough from either side of politics, given the absolute wealth that abounds within Australia. If you're interested in looking at that report, I'll put this link in the description of the video. Neither side of politics can hold their head up high when they've allowed a situation to develop where aged care workers are paid $22 an hour for what is a very challenging job, while at the same time workers at Bunnings are paid at least $27 an hour if you believe the commentary in the media. It is pleasing to see Labor say it will fully enact the recommendations of the review into wages in the aged care sector, but will they actually implement that if elected? As far as Scomo is concerned, it's unclear how a coalition government would respond to a recommended 25% increase for aged care workers. But if past history is anything to go by, don't hold your breath waiting for aged care workers to be paid the same as those being employed at Bunnings. And so in the end, what do I really think? Well, the difference between a Labor government and a coalition government will, at best, be marginal around the edges. Neither side of politics have the courage or, in my view, the social intelligence to address the major structural problems with the wage and the taxation frameworks. Mention the word GST and they both run for cover because that's political dynamite, just as franking credits was 3 years ago for the Labor Party. So regardless of who wins, it will be business as usual for those that are well off and are able to structure their investments to grow their wealth at a good clip. And those who are struggling will just continue to struggle, in my view. What will be interesting will be the extent to which independents and the Greens can gain representation in either of the Houses of Parliament. And in South Australia, we have Nick Xenophon reappearing as a candidate for the Senate. So it'll be interesting in our state to see whether his old army of supporters will be willing to back him again. There does seem to be a groundswell of support for moderate independents with a commitment to prosecuting the argument for action on climate change and integrity within government. Both Labor and the Coalition only have themselves to blame for this, as they have had 15 years to get their act into gear and have failed. Perhaps a hung parliament with plenty of savvy independents in the lower house might be the best outcome. What do you think? And if you believe the Greens, they just might be holding the balance of power in the Senate all on their own. And what do you think of that? Well, we'll know our fate on May 21. Well, thanks so much for watching, and if you would like to contribute to the conversation, please remember to do so in a respectful way.